Okay, let's jump right into this. You know, when you hear the name Abraham, I bet you instantly picture this solitary, peaceful shepherd, right? Just kind of wandering the ancient desert with a little flock of sheep. But what if I told you that one of the absolute most famous encounters in his entire life reads way less like a pastoral poem and actually a whole lot more like a high stakes geopolitical thriller? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the ancient historical records surrounding Genesis chapter 14. We'll be pulling from some seriously fascinating archaeological and linguistic research to reveal the gritty, real-world military dynamics of the ancient Near East. So the big central question we really need to wrap our heads around is this. Think about that famous meeting where Melchizedek, this mysterious king of Salem, offers bread and wine to Abraham. Now, for literal centuries, people have viewed this almost exclusively through a strictly spiritual lens. But we really need to step back and ask ourselves, especially when you look at the military context of the ancient world. Was this just a purely mystical religious rite, or was it actually a shrewd, boots-on-the-ground military negotiation meant to appease a seriously dominant regional warlord? To actually get to the bottom of this, we've got to weigh two totally competing paradigms. On one hand, you have the traditional theological view. This one usually interprets the bread and wine as a super peaceful, almost Eucharistic proto-sacrament. But then, you had the historical view, which totally flips the script. It argues that this was a hyper-pragmatic, Bronze Age military appeasement strategy. And for this explainer, we're going to laser focus on that historical view. We're grounding this narrative in the actual, documented military and diplomatic customs of the 2nd millennium BC. Because honestly, understanding this completely reshapes how we read ancient history. All right, to understand why this meeting even happened in the first place, we have to set the stage. And it all kicks off with the number 14. According to the ancient texts, a group of Transjordanian cities had been living as vassals. Basically, they were paying heavy tribute to a massive foreign superpower for 12 straight years. Finally, in the 13th year, they'd had enough and they rebelled. But in the 14th year, the empire struck back. This whole vicious cycle of subjection, heavy taxation, eventual rebellion, and then brutal retaliation, well, that was pretty much standard operating procedure for the ancient Near East. And man, the empire that struck back was actually a terrifying, massive Mesopotamian coalition. We're talking about heavy hitters here. You have Amar-Phel of Shinar representing Babylonia, Arath of Elasar, Chedorlaomer of Elam, and Tidal of Goyim representing Anatolia. Look, this was absolutely not some minor border skirmish. This was a highly coordinated invasion for 4 ruthless warrior kings from all across Mesopotamia and the Hittite regions. They swept down into the Levant with one singular, terrifying goal: completely crush the rebellion and violently reassert their dominance. And you know what's crazy? The linguistic evidence proves this isn't just some myth. It is authentic military history. Top scholars like Kenneth Kitchen point out that the names involved perfectly match the era. Take the king named Tidal, for example. That name perfectly aligns with the Hittite name Tudkalia, which is a name actually used by 4 different rulers in that exact region between 1400 and 1200 BC. The names, the vocabulary, and the very structure of a multi-king coalition, they fit the geopolitical realities of the 2nd millennium BC to an absolute T. Okay, so the 4 kings sweep through, they crush the rebellion, and they take captives, including Abraham's own nephew, Lot. Hearing this, Abraham sets off to rescue him. But hold on. This brings us to a massive, glaring logistical puzzle. Think about it. How in the world could Abraham, who we usually think of as just a simple pastoralist, take on the victorious combined field armies of 4 Mesopotamian kings with a force of just 318 men? Mathematically speaking, it sounds completely impossible, right? Well, let's look at the text. It says, Abraham mustered 318 of his trained men. But if we dig into the ancient Hebrew word used here, which is chanik, things get really interesting. This is actually a highly specific military term. It's likely an Egyptian loanword, and we actually find it in the 15th century BC Tanakh tablets. It definitely doesn't mean a hired mercenary. It specifically refers to a fiercely loyal, highly trained retainer or militia member who is born right there in the master's house. So actually, scratch that whole Abraham was just a shepherd idea. He was a formidable tribal chieftain with his own professional standing militia. But come on, even 318 elite, highly trained troops aren't going to be enough to take on 4 victorious kings. So here is the absolute crucial point. Abraham didn't fight alone. He had actually formed a mutual defense treaty with 3 Amorite chieftains, Mamre, Aner, and Eshcol. Now, if each of those allied chieftains brought a similarly sized militia of, say, about 300 men, well, now Abraham is actually leading a combined strike force of over 1,000 to 1,200 trained warriors.
Okay, suddenly the math makes sense. This was definitely a force large enough to execute a devastating coordinated ambush.
And wow, what an ambush it was. Let's quickly trace the chronology of this rescue campaign. Abraham gets the terrible news, immediately musters his allied forces, and rapidly pursues this enemy coalition all the way north to Dan. He hits them in the dead of night when they least expect it, completely routing the Mesopotamian armies and chasing them way up past Damascus to Hobah. He recovers literally all the stolen loot, frees Lot, and begins his triumphant march back south to the valley of Shaveh. In a matter of days, Abraham has basically just established himself as the absolute premier military power in the entire region. Now, on his return route, Abraham has this incredibly significant meeting with two local kings, and the contrast between these two guys is absolutely striking. First up, you have Bera, the king of Sodom. This guy shows up completely empty-handed and basically immediately starts making these arrogant demands of Abraham. But then you have Melchizedek, the king of Salem, which, by the way, is ancient Jerusalem. Melchizedek is generous, he's respectful, and he famously brings out bread and wine to greet the victorious commander. So what's the actual historical reality behind this famous gesture? Well, ancient military historians point out that this was clearly a token of goodwill. The goal was to supply the exhausted warriors and serve as a mark of gratitude to Abram. You see, in the brutal context of ancient warfare, offering bread and wine wasn't primarily some ethereal religious symbol. It was actually the absolute standard diplomatic protocol for provisioning a returning, exhausted, and, frankly, incredibly dangerous army. In fact, we see this exact historical repeating diplomatic provisioning play out over and over again in the ancient world. Think about when Jacob returned home to face his heavily armed brother Esau. He sent massive herds of animals ahead to appease him. Later on, when a young David and his 400-man militia were insulted by Nabal, Nabal's brilliant wife Abigail rushed out with hundreds of loaves of bread and skins of wine just to stop David from slaughtering her entire household. And during Absalom's rebellion, Ziba provided the fleeing King David with bread, raisins, and wine. These aren't just nice gifts. These are highly calculated survival strategies. Because honestly, if you didn't proactively appease a dominant military force in your territory, the results were entirely catastrophic. To see the terrifying alternative, we can look at historical reliefs, like the one showing Ramesses II's brutal attack on the walled city of Dapur. When you see depictions of this era, it's all chariots, volleys of arrows, and the absolute devastation of a city whose defenses are just completely collapsing. This is the very real, very terrifying context of Bronze Age warfare that a king like Melchizedek would be desperately trying to avoid at all costs. And right in the middle of these historical depictions of sieges, you often find something fascinating. Imagine the city is falling and the ruler's wife actually exits the besieged walls. And what is she carrying right to the Egyptian prince who is literally poised to execute her husband? She is offering a sealed Canaanite amphora of wine and massive baskets piled high with bread. It's this desperate, highly visual plea for mercy. She's offering food and drink to the conquerors, specifically to pacify their wrath. The linguistic evidence from the time builds this case even further. Take the Egyptian hieroglyphs used to spell the word shrum, which literally translates to begging for peace. The physical posturing of the figures in the hieroglyphs features raised arms and kneeling. That is the exact same posture of surrender and beseeching mercy that we see depicted by the defeated leaders in those war reliefs. The physical act of offering provisions and the linguistic concept of begging for peace are just completely intertwined in the ancient mind. This crucial point is summarized perfectly in the Papyrus Anastasii I, which is an incredible Ramesside military text. The Egyptian word for begging for peace, which is shrim, is directly related to the word shremt, which literally translates to a complimentary gift or provisions, meaning the standard military ration for troops, like bread, meat, and wine, was quite literally synonymous with a peace offering. It was a simple transaction. You supplied the army, so the army wouldn't destroy you. So bringing this all the way back to Genesis 14, Melchizedek's actions make perfect, pragmatic sense. Think about it. Abraham has just annihilated a massive Mesopotamian coalition. He is marching a massive, victorious, and likely totally exhausted army directly past Melchizedek's city of Salem. Melchizedek wasn't just being spiritually hospitable out of nowhere. He was acting as a shrewd, brilliant diplomat. He rode out with the standard military provisions of bread and wine to appease Abraham. He was honoring the new dominant regional warlord to secure peace for his own city. Which leaves us with one final, totally fascinating thought. Abraham had absolutely all the power here. Yet when this local king offers him a diplomatic peace offering, Abraham responds by giving Melchizedek a tenth of all the spoils of war. He recognizes him not just as a king, but as a priest of El Elyon, God Most High. If this entire encounter was genuinely rooted in brutal, real-world military diplomacy, how much more profound does it make Abraham's sudden display of spiritual humility and mutual recognition? It just completely changes how we read the history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the ancient world.